My father works for NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency. He is an engineer. He says it's the best job he can imagine. I was only 2 years old when my dad started his job. Back then, nobody had ever been in space, but both the Americans and the Russians were developing rockets to take people there. The Russians launched the satellite Sputnik before we sent anything into space. And this time we really wanted to beat them. But they got there first, when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. We weren't far behind, though. Not much more than a month passed, when the astronaut Alan Shepard flew into space. That was the beginning of the Mercury program, and soon the Americans were entering space and staying there longer and longer. And now everybody was wondering, where will we travel next? Could we really fly all the way to the moon? The Russians wanted to go there. Could we beat them to the moon? It would take a lot of research and invention, a lot of hard work, and a ton of money. But President Kennedy said we should do it before the decade is over. Lots of people didn't think it was possible, but he did.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
At first, things didn't go very well. The Russians were spending more hours in space and orbiting the Earth more times. They made their first flights with a full 3-person space crew and the very first spacewalk. But we were fighting to catch up. And we finally did, during the Gemini program. Soon we were making spacewalks too. We beat the Russians' endurance record, and we completed the very first rendezvous between 2 space vehicles. We were learning so many things all the time. And meanwhile, the Russians were losing the race to the moon. Then something horrible happened. At the very beginning of the Apollo program, a fire on the launch pad during a training exercise killed the 3 astronauts who were going to fly Apollo 1. The Russians had a bad accident too, when their Soyuz 1 spacecraft crashed at the end of a mission with 1 cosmonaut aboard. The space programs were in trouble. Everybody at NASA had to work extra hard to come up with better ways of keeping our astronauts safe. My dad says it was a really hard time for everyone, but it made them better at their jobs. It took almost a year before we launched another manned spaceflight, but the crew of Apollo 7 flew an 11-day mission in October. Now Apollo 8 is on its way to circle around the moon.